I haven't read a creepypasta in a while. So, little story about me. When I was much younger, I was at my grandmother's house and it was raining pretty hard, so I couldn't go to sleep. So, like any normal kid, I went onto YouTube and for some reason, there was Entity 303 videos on my recommended. I watched them and was scared to death, so my first reaction was to look for more. I then found the Creepypasta wiki, where I read some Minecraft creepypastas. I only remember reading one about a white ender dragon with green eyes, and then the next one after that scared me so much that I went back to bed. If only I could remember it. So, in the spirit of Halloween season and my love of rigatoni pastas, I decided why not read every creepypasta in the gaming category and rank them. So, that's what my dumbass has decided to do. Also, for reference of how I'm ranking these, I'll be considering how well they're written, how scary they are, how creative they are, and how much of an impact they've had. That last one is more for fun, though. Also, before you get excited that because of that graphic this is all going to be animated, no. I'm just going to use background footage of video game footage I've gotten in the past, so this will mostly be for audio enjoyment. Anyway, I really hope you enjoy the video, and continue with my previous statement. I will only be using the category gaming and video games, so if there are any gaming-related creepypastas you know that I didn't cover, which there will be a lot, it wasn't under that category. If you guys enjoy this, I might someday check out the famous creepypastas section, and I also just realized that the ones I had been talking about earlier were on, fandom wikis. The site I'll be using is more official, but this option is just simplest for my brain. And the website I'm using for reference is creepypasta.com. So that's what I'm basing it off of. Also, there will be two that will be omitted because one of them is literally a discussion post, and the other one wasn't related to video games at all. Another thing is that this is going to be edited and recorded on my new laptop. I finally fixed the audio issues I'd been having. So, now we start. Let's check out the first one. It's called Raven Grove Online. This shouldn't be too bad. Oh. Shit. Yeah, I forgot creepypastas are actual story passion projects. Ooh, this will take longer than I expected.
One eternity later.
Yeah, that was actually pretty good. Okay, so Raven Grove Online is a story about a 40-year-old man who was contacted by a young girl named Chloe, who wanted to make an RPG game off of a book he had published 20 years ago. The girl promises to work tirelessly with her team to finish the game as a product. The author gets sent the game by Chloe and is blown away. From how it's described, it sounds like a mixture between RuneScape and old WoW graphics. The author slowly gets addicted to the game and basically completes it, but continues to log in for weeks on end, sinking in countless hours until Chloe stops responding to him, and the game receives massive gameplay overhauls. Features and mechanics are constantly being changed, until a 40-gigabyte update has a character missing, the initial sacrifice character that starts the whole story off. The game slowly becomes a horror as vital NPCs disappear, so the author decides a plan to stop the NPCs from dying by running his computer to watch over them. He eventually has his son log into the game through his computer and levels him up until he finds Chloe's old custom character at low health. He strikes her, killing her. She just replies, "You too, huh?" Then the author's son's computer character gets sent to a mountain where he's faced with the ritual character with a deer head instead, who is too strong and immediately defeats him. The author goes back to his main account in which he tries to slay the beast and almost does it, but then he gets sent back to the beginning area. And when he goes to try to look for the original town, he finds a graveyard with unsent text messages and sad songs etched into the stones. The author realizes that Chloe was a troubled individual and closes out with a paragraph stating that you aren't alone and you should let people into your personal island, as to have them enjoy the sights. And that was Raven Grove Online. B tier, honestly. Okay, I should explain. I really enjoyed the story. I believe it's an interesting premise, but to me it's not incredibly creative to the extent that some others may be. Now, I'm not talking about the ghost in the machine archetype, but more so the person gets lost in their work, then becomes it with no explanation. I do love the ending message and how it's very nice. I love the progression of stages in addiction by the author. The author goes from a cynical old man believing that his time for video games have passed, but then he slowly becomes addicted to the game. I've personally witnessed people with video game addiction specifically, and I see the process being displayed as 100% believable in this story. My only other gripe is the writing style. I understand the author's supposed to be 40 and was also an amateur writer, but not everything needs to be written as eloquently as a soliloquy. It just got a little tedious to read. Yes, I understand the words and I appreciate the elegant sound of it, but it just got a bit odd to me personally. Still, really good overall, and I recommend this as a read. Next on the list is Wild Isle. This one is an odd one. So the premise is that the author is alone for his parents' house in Maine. He's been bored and snowed in after leaving from college to take a break, and after all the boring Netflix shows, he needs a change in routine. This change comes in the form of a Wii he remembers having, and finds a copy of a game called Wild Isle that just looks like an Animal Crossing knockoff. But as he's playing it, when going to sleep, he wakes up at 3:13 with an odd feeling and notices a red car on the side of the street, but he can only see the hood of it as it's snowed down. Over the next few days, the author keeps seeing a weird goat character with red eyes in the game that creeps him out. He slowly notices more and more of the red car each night at 3:13 in the morning. He sees a goat figure resembling that of the creepy one with red eyes and a plastered smile in the car. 2 nights later, tries to come out of his TV to take him until he runs and drives away to Georgia. But he can't shake the feeling he's been followed, waiting for that red car to pass by. I would say another solid B tier, but a bit lower in my opinion. The story actually makes less sense than the last. The whole red car and the goat thing popping out of there and then the screen don't make much sense to me. Like, the logical leaps between tied to a car and then a video game and then that car having like 100 copies of the video game, it's a bit confusing for me, and I don't really see the line of reason. For the first story, for example, there's a logical line that says, she's dead, she in game. This one is a bit more erratic, so I'd say slightly lower B. Next, we have I made a horror game about liminal spaces that nobody will ever play. This one was decently creative and pretty meta. It starts with the author talking about his game dev journey to making a liminal space horror game, as it was becoming popular at the time. So, he decides to send a build to his friend, who messages him asking how to open the red door. But the author never made a red door. The author just changes the texture and works on the next level, which is closer to a school hallway look. He sends it over to his friend again, who asks, what's with the dumb red door again? You can't open it. So he checks it out, finds a 3D red door this time. After this, he starts on the final level, which he's developing, and has the door appear in the level as he's testing the camera movement. He goes through it and finds himself in a red hallway maze that he can barely tell the difference between wall and ceiling. Continuing, he finds a screen with a creepy face saying, "Welcome, guest 185. Henry is here, and he's losing his patience with you. Leave before he runs out." The author runs until the patience meter reaches 0, when Henry decides to visit him by exploding his window. The author runs to open the door into the rest of his apartment when he realizes he never left the game. Or, at least the works it made. He runs to find another red door as his exit and finds he's across the street back home. But not his home. His mother says she never had a son, and his best friend claims to have never known anyone like him. The author becomes a homeless person sleeping on benches and dumpster diving, writing this story to warn others. With a final thought, the author says, "If I was guest 185, who were the other 184? I loved this one. Solidly written, like somebody who genuinely had a crazy experience. Honestly, A tier. I kind of like how nothing is vague or insinuated. They actively mention stuff like creepypastas in the back room, showing that maybe he left our universe, or an identically similar universe, trying to convince us that he really did change universes. Honestly, I really like this premise, and I think its execution was very well done. Next is the story The Maze. This one isn't my favorite. So, the author is very good friends with the family who runs a retro video game shack. He's considered a loyal customer and even family because of how much he goes to experience the place and the owners. Sadly, the father of the family dies and leaves the author some assorted games, one being a floppy disk called The Maze. The author starts playing the game and gets addicted. Eventually, the message pops up saying, "Something has entered the maze." This keeps happening and leads to the author having strange dreams of hearing, "Something has entered the maze." A friend of the family from the retro stack approaches the author and tells them a story about how they had gotten copies of the game and had experienced the ill effects of the game. One friend went insane, another took their own life, and the 3 who survived lived on with the trauma of the maze. Two of them being the husband and wife who own the retro shack. The author tries to resist playing the game but can't. He plays more and more until eventually snaps out of it and smashes it with a hammer. Sometimes, still hearing, something has entered the... I didn't like this one as much. Let's be honest, this is definitely a creepy situation, but the writing style and path the story takes doesn't make it as creepy as it could be. I would say this one might be C tier. There's not really a lot of crazy properties to the game copy itself, just having effects on the players, but this seems more like a hysteria than a crazy entity. I just think it could have had a better build-up and ending, but I enjoyed it. A high C tier, I would say. I'm just not the biggest fan of the writing style that's present. I know the real reason Silent Hills was canceled is confusing. This story has the author receive an email from a random individual who claims to have been an anonymous tipper that gave companies the message that PT, or Silent Hills as it was known, to be canceled. The person writing the email knew because he had been directly involved in its creation. Soon into development, the developer started dying, and they realized it was because of the ghost in PT, leading Konami to delete it and the project to be canceled. The developer ends the email with mentioning that he can still feel the ghost's breath following behind him. I like this one. I like how creative it is. It's an interesting premise considering it's about the famous PT demo, which is a pretty infamous demo that appeared on the PlayStation Store and was for the Silent Hills franchise. If you're curious about it, there's far deeper dives that you can look for. I actually really like it, but it's not written the best, and I think it could have had some improvements. But other than that, short and simple. I'd say maybe low to mid B tier. Jane's Retina is a story where the author describes a homebrew game from the San Francisco Bay Area. The game is considered an art project and was in numbered floppy disks in the 1980s. The game starts with a disturbing title screen of a perfectly cut eye and optic nerve sprayed in a blue napkin. The game, if you can call it that, had the camera move closer and closer to the face of the woman named Jane. The camera gets closer and closer and closer to her left eye, but doesn't stop there. It continues to go further in through her eye until it eventually starts retracting, where we exit through the gaping hole in which her left eye used to be. Furthering out, Jane is clearly dead, and no one knows who she ever was. That's basically it. The story estimated time is 6 minutes. I finished it in like 3. 90% of it is detail. It's a very bland story, but I actually think it's a really creative idea, and I quite liked it. I'm going to say this is a high B-tiered creepypasta. It's written over formally, but it was enjoyable. Not the most creepy unless you're really freaked out by overly detailed descriptive body horror. Otherwise, pretty good. Just not as much substance as I would like. Next we have Circe. I think that's how it's pronounced. The author starts by saying he used to hear an urban legend about a game cabinet called Circe. That's what I'm going to be calling it. But he can't find anything about it online. He wants to learn more about the legend, so he calls a mall owner who had an arcade that supposedly held the cabinet. Meeting up with the owner, he shows it to him, not before the owner loses control of himself and the author tries to back away as he's crying over the cabinet. The author then gets pulled down to the floor and locked in the room with the cabinet in which he starts playing it. The owner screams at him, "Don't touch the cabinet!" asking if he fears God. The author keeps playing the cabinet, of course. At first it's just a normal game, but after he gets a score, it corrupts in static, and the cabinet asks, "Do you fear God?" After his next game, a red filter appears over the game screen, making it difficult to play, which makes him quit and try to leave, in which the owner, now with hollowed eyes and a toothless grin, tells him that God has a special plan for him. This one is pretty mediocre. It starts pretty strong with an interesting idea, but slowly loses steam later in the story. I found myself agreeing with the people in the comments below the story about plot holes that didn't make sense and the idea that the ending doesn't feel satisfying or make sense. Honestly, C tier. Great opening, good writing style overall, just a disappointed ending. The Bethesda cult surrounds the author getting addicted to Fallout 4, but he notices something that just sticks out to him. Everywhere he looks, he sees the word end. Every mention and implementation of it jumps out to him. He eventually finds a terminal that just repeats it over and over again. He asks his friends, but he doesn't understand. He asks his friend about it, but he doesn't understand, trying to leave the house, but Eventually, when he comes back, it just feels like he never left, as everything just says end all over his room. So, the only reasonable solution is to visit E3 and watch Todd Howard give his speech on upcoming games. The author eventually meets with Todd Howard and gets a business card with him, telling the author that the end is soon, and he's been invited to join a group to prepare for this end. Eventually, the author heads back to his hotel and sees that the TV now has the same Fallout 4 screen, with the never-ending multiplication of end. When he gets a phone call from his father, his brother has died overseas from radiation poisoning, even though no bombs or leaks have been noticed. He turns off his phone after his father asks him about a letter addressed to him that says, Fallout 76 beta copy. This story is so freaking well written, but there's two major issues. One, there's no real ending, and two, there's no real horror. There's no, and I saw the bombs outside my window, or anything. The ending is so ambiguous that it doesn't even allow for horror to seep in. Honestly, this was very well written, but it's just not creepy. It's just like a conspiracy thing, and then it just ends. Honestly, low C tier. I only say this because I enjoyed the story, but oh my god, is the end just disappointing, and it's not really a creepypasta. Beta Test is an eerie tale where the author once worked at a VR development company and now does QA for different projects. He meets with an old friend at a virtual bar, and they get to talking when suddenly a man collapses behind them in the bar. He claims he's drowning and is going crazy, throwing people off of him. He's going through acute solipsism syndrome. Yeah, laugh at the acronym. This sends the author into a flashback as he remembers when he first got offered this QA job. He was brought into the Siberian mountains, where in a shack they brought him into the earth through an elevator and told him that he would be part of something big. They were told they would use stasis-like pods and don VR equipment to test the capabilities of this immersive experience. Back to the present, the author sees the woman running the test, Mara, appear at the bar and then disappear. The author takes a walk afterward through their AI village of sorts. He stumbles into a part of town without lights. All of them are now off, and there is an old man in front of him. He's naked and wearing the same suits they had been when they started the test. The man jumps the author and screams what seemed like incoherent nonsense about getting out of the simulation and the people trying to kill the author. Then he realizes something. That tattoo on the old man's arm. It's the same as the tattoo he'd gotten in real life. He pushes the man off of him and runs as he's hit by lights to make him freeze, in which the author goes to ask Mara questions. She's on a building sipping wine and explains it's an anomaly. She explains that he was the author's past self, warning him as a ghost. That these servers could run for eons without human input and were made by rich billionaires that wanted to live forever. The author understands what Mara is telling him and chooses to go drink away these memories at the bar. This one is a good, solid A tier, honestly. The story was well written, the horror was pretty well used, and it feels like what a creepypasta in essence should feel like. The VR aspects of it are pretty cool, and the overall attention to detail through the story is admirable. Now, Rule 34 is it's an odd story, in which the author is a lonely individual who's been told by his friend that women aren't worth it. So, he just leaves himself to images and videos of his favorite characters, let's say. One being Tracer, of course. He finds new videos of Tracer which are so realistic, and he loves them because it really feels like he's with Tracer. Slowly he realizes that the Tracer in the video is alive, and that she talks directly to him, and even brings herself into his games. So she tells him that the only way to bring her to life is to kill someone, bring Tracer into his world. Unsurprisingly, he kills someone to become his Tracer sacrifice, and she comes through the screen and literally tears his arm off. He runs away and wakes up in the ICU, where he's told his apartment was hit by an animal attack with a broken window, and nobody else in his flat noticed. He lives on the 6th floor, though. So, who knows what happens to that monster that tore his arm off. Now, disregarding the premise, this is actually a pretty good story. I actually really like the story progression, and while its NSFW tag does seem like it wouldn't be that good, it doesn't focus on the Rule 34 aspect more than the horror. It's pretty surreal, and I actually quite like the ending. High B tier. Halloween 64 is a story where the author details their experience with a haunted N64 cartridge that appeared at his door. He details the horror of the levels. The first level has the player going down a neighborhood street that looked eerily similar to the author's and took hours to get through without losing the life he was given for the game. This is when the next level, where the player has to go through a house and find different weapons, appears. This section made the author's apartment freezing, but he couldn't take his gaze off the game or he would lose more lives. The third section had the author kill someone in a bed, but every hit on the body would affect the author in real life. Not by stabbing him or actually giving trauma, but he would feel every hit of pain. With the eventual death of the character, the author completes the game, blacks out, and the game is gone, praying to the next person who plays it. I'm very torn with this. It's pretty creepy and eerie as well as being A-tier writing, but it's less of a story and more instructions if you get the game. I think I'm going to put it in A tier, though, because of the fact that, while creepy, it's not the most it could have been, as this more feels like a recounting of an experience for the sake of instructions. The Twitch stream is a really chilling creepypasta that gets instant S tier, and I'll explain now. The author is a large Twitch streamer who decides for their 6th anniversary will have a special stream where they can play with viewers with their chosen game. The third viewer on the stream is a 7-year-old named Tanner. While they start playing, in the background of Tanner's audio, there's a glass smashing sound. There's an intruder. The intruder murders Tanner's parents, and the author calls the police and immediately shifts his attention from Minecraft to making sure Tanner survives. The author calls the cops, and when one comes around, he's heard that the cop gets ambushed by the intruder and brutally beheaded. Tanner hears him coming to the basement, so instead of trying to hide or escape, he trips the intruder coming down the stairs, stabbing him, and the author ending the story with a philosophical realization of violence and boredom and how it affects our psyche. This, as I said earlier, is an instant S tier. I really like the way the story is written. Everything about it is good in my opinion. I love the direction of the horror it took. Now, I don't believe it's a good video game creepypasta, even though it's tagged that way. I think it's related enough that it'll stay, though. The realistic type of horror it chooses made my skin crawl, because unlike a demonic cartridge for N64 or a trapped soul in a video game character, this is a legitimately possible situation someone could be in. That's why it's so scary to me. But yeah, S tier. I love the writing and logical line it has. Don't Install the Hangman app is where the author finds an ad for a game called Hangman, where you have to use your phone to catch people in a virtual noose, and well, yeah. The author downloads it and then picks a target when he sees them at the mall and then, well, gets them. This ends with him looking at the app's next suggested target, noticing the next one is his brother. Now for this story, I'm leaving out a lot of detail, largely because I just don't want to get into the details. Just read it yourself if you're that interested. Some stories like this are well written. I just don't want to reword it because it's a bit more graphic than what I would like to repeat. Doesn't mean I didn't like the premise. Personally, I agree with comments that it ended a bit early, and I feel like it could have gone further, but I think it's good as it is. I would say maybe mid or lower A tier story. Our next story is I Will Never Play Another Mario Game Again. This one has our author yearning for an N64, but his parents are having disagreements and money is tight. But on his 12th birthday, his parents give him $250, which he uses to buy a console and a game that the employee said his boss told him not to sell. As he makes his way back, he wonders why one of his friends hadn't even been to school in a couple days. And he goes home to do his homework and eventually gets to playing it. The game has eerie messages from the past owner, likely a hacker, that tells them to stop playing the game. A bunch of creepy stuff happens, like Bowser turning into a creepy humanoid figure with black eyes and sharp teeth, and Mario eventually turning into something similar. The author hears banging at his door and Mario tries to come out of his TV, in which the author rushes out of his house by breaking a window. After that, the author wakes up in the ICU after his house burned down and he got a head injury. He later finds out when he got back to school that his friend Jeff had been found beaten and strangled with his N64 controller. And eventually, his parents had sold the console and cartridge to the game store that the author had gone to. I again skipped over a lot of important details with my summary, but this one is another mid to low A tier in my opinion. I like the writing because it does sound like a fond memory at first, but I don't like the crazy attention to detail. Some points included I think are a bit overly specific, but that's up to opinion. I do like the setup for everything, however, and that's not even to mention how chilling the ending is for when you read it. Now, One Word Story is a creepypasta focused on the author playing a chat game, where you play against others to make stories one word at a time. But his power goes out, so he checks out his phone and looks for more sites, and then he finds a new site. This new site is very specific and has interesting players and categories. He starts playing against a new person named Doppelganger. They start playing under mystery, and the author thinks the other player is just trying to creep him out, with the creepy sentences of him being at his window with a weapon. The author laughs at the absurdity and then sees his laptop monitor turn into a spider web. A bullet is peeking out of it. A man in a mask is in his window, and the author guns it to hide in his closet. The man shoots the author's sheets in the bathroom, thinking he's hiding there. The man goes and taking the author's keys in the dresser drawers. The author waits for what feels like hours for him to leave and tries to go to the police, not realizing at first that there's a new line on the website at his computer. Rematch? I feel like it would be a major disservice to put this one into anything but S tier, honestly. I love it. I personally enjoy the writing and the approach of the story. There are creepy internet stories where people were able to find others' coordinates based on cookies or metadata in websites. This sounds like something that 4chan or Reddit communities would be involved in if it were real, honestly. But I really like this one. It's great. Now, our first famous one. Ben Drowned is a creepypasta that has become infamous over the years, but in the briefest summary for time's sake, this thing is long as hell. A college student gets an N64 and a haunted copy of Majora's Mask that has the soul of a boy named Ben who drowned in it. He goes crazy, and through a series of events, Ben eventually gets into the author's laptop to torment him. This eventually leads to the author leaving his roommate a flash drive with a document of his findings and a video and a set of instructions. Now, I did say earlier I would mention history and influence when it came down to it. Obviously, for those who have been in the Legend of Zelda community or seen the icebergs or creepypastas, Ben Drowned is famous in this case. I've seen this one spread around the internet so many times, and even if you don't know a creepypasta itself, you've likely seen one of the many images or videos associated with it. Honestly, I think it's A tier, but it's not there because of my enjoyment of the story. Now, I do think it's pretty creative for the time it was made, and parts of it are really well written. Annoyingly, on creepypasta.com, it says it was written in 2017, and it has a bunch of side points regarding the history of it rather than just its story. So this was first posted on an X forum in 2010 from what I found, and honestly, seems about right for the time and the earlier horror scene. It's a good story, but I do see some of the faults in its age now. Ultimately, pretty good. Definitely important in creepypasta history, but honestly a little overhyped. Our next story is Razor Games. The author's an audio engineer for a game production studio that has been struggling. Out of the blue, they snag a $9 million contract for a VR game, but they have to finish it before Halloween. They pull all-nighters and everything, but notice some odd quirks. Pause menus won't work. There's an odd section of code they have to implement in the AI, and everyone praises how truly immersive the VR is. But there's one large error. Every first playthrough, the enemies won't go by their proper programming. After a long weekend, the author heads back into the office so they can finalize the release of the game and find their two testers dead and practically skinned. Security footage shows them leaving the office with odd features and carrying the headsets with them. Months after the incident, one of the tech engineers finds that his secret non-internet connected computer captured some interesting footage. It shows the beta testers and what happened to them. They get attacked in the game and swell to have the monsters come out of them and steal their skin to hide and sneak out of the offices. Most horrifyingly, the author notices that on Facebook, he saw an ad for a game that looked exactly like what they had developed. This one is hard. I really am torn on how to rate this one again. I think that it's creepy premise, and I like the VR story a bit more than the last one, but the last one had more existential horror in it. Another really good creepypasta deserving of the A tier. A Figure in Grey is a short creepypasta where the author details information about the game series of Paperboy, considering its first and second installment of Paper Delivery Chaos. Through the creepypasta, we learn there's a dark secret in the second Paperboy game. There's a Grey character who's not aggressive or crazy like the other enemies, but merely sits there with a dark secret of what or whom he's throwing into the garbage can. This creepypasta, before I explain, is in C tier. That sounds bad, but it's not the reason you'd think. Now, like the first half of the entire creepypasta is a political satire on 50s America. I'm not even joking. I think the creepiness of it could have been played better, and I think the overanalyzation of politics and minor details of characters from the horror literally focus on the creepypasta. It honestly feels like an afterthought. This really disappointed me because I see a lot of potential in the idea of a figure in gray. Just it sadly wasn't utilized very well. The Shame is our next tale, where the author is someone who prefers books to games. The author wants to impress his friends with a new game, so he looks to find one called The Shame, which according to another forum user will grant your greatest wish. The author continues to go through the game, but one of his friends gets in a coma from a car accident. Another one gets in a coma for committing suicide, and the other takes a copious amount of drugs to almost die. The author eventually gets his greatest desire, which was his old lover, but he wants his friends back, so he chooses to go through the game again to get back his friends, replacing his own life. This story is one of the higher grades, gaining an A tier because of how good it is. This uses horror elements and suspense pretty well, in my opinion, and I love the twist ending. I didn't mention it because I think you should read it yourself to see just how good of a creepypasta this is. All in all, good creepypasta with some minor spelling errors, but a good atmosphere and a good line of logic, which, as you might know from this point, I really appreciate. Also, wait a minute, I think I just realized I didn't explain the line of logic. Uh-oh. So, line of logic is like, well, a line of logic. I prefer in creepypastas when things actually make sense. Like, if there's a demon, then you should be able to dispel it using salt or holy water. That should make sense. But, like, throwing a brick at it and then summoning it through a lamp, like just a regular plug-in lamp, stuff like that doesn't make sense. Now, that's an example that won't come up, but things like Ben drowned, it makes sense because there's a soul in the Game Boy cartridge, and linking the Game Boy cartridge up to the laptop leads it to getting on the laptop, and then influencing the drive and the documents. That's a line of logic that I think makes sense. Even the Tracer-related one made sense. It was like a demon. It was like a demonic presence. Yes, it only showed itself through videos at first, but it slowly started warping other medias. And while how it got to those medias didn't really make much sense, it was kind of more of a hallucination because no one else really noticed the character in the games. So I think that would be also a good other example of line of logic. Anyway, back to the actual stories. Our next story is called Willow Creek. This story centers around a single father who chooses to get a beta disc of a game called Willow Creek. He plays it with his son, and the author completes the first mystery of the game, in which he solved the crime of who pushed a man into the blast furnace at a steel mill. Then all of a sudden, the author gets a weird call from a man who exclaims excitedly, thanking the author for saving him. The author thinks this is just a sick prank, but chooses to go to sleep. He wakes up late the next morning with his 10-year-old son leaving a note saying he made himself breakfast and left for school. The author continues into the next case, which revolves around finding a woman's identity from the remains found in a construction site. After the completing of the case, he's horrified to see a name, the same as his deceased wife. He gets another phone call. This call isn't from who he thinks. His son's school is telling them that, well, his son is missing, and he hasn't come to school. He asks them to call the police. In his desperate state, he's in the house when someone knocks on the door, but it isn't his son. It's his previously dead wife, but he doesn't understand, and she explains that she was locked in a cage with hundreds of others and explains that there was a date in which they were captured and a date exactly a year from that date in which they would be gotten rid of. He tries to complete the last mission thinking it will bring back his son, but nothing happens. Only when he goes out into the yard and screams to take him instead does his son appear with his hands up. But it looks like he's holding someone's hand, more than just waving. The family happily reunited until the author is pulled into the translucent cloak of the figure and finds himself in the said prison with his date on the wall. This is another S-tier story in my opinion. I love the details and the series of events, and it's just great. No wonder this won first place in the website's writing event that was held when it was written, apparently. I personally think that you should all read it too, but that's even if you get this far into the video. What is it going to be, like an hour? The haunted Game Boy camera follows the author as they talk about how their family was poor and he really wanted a Game Boy Color. Instead, he got a busted up old original Game Boy with a printer and camera. He threw a tantrum and it was given to his older brother, who had used it but then became worried about the prints. The author checked the prints and saw his brother doing silly faces, but then noticed it changed, making him look scared and like he was running away from the camera. With the final picture, half the face was blurred with black pixels. 2 weeks later, his brother got hit by a car, looking similar to those images. Similarly, his sister had the same happen, where her final photo was almost entirely black with little recognition. Months later, his sister was involved in a car accident. The detectives only knew it was his sister because the car she was driving belonged to her father. She was burnt and completely unrecognizable. The author tried to get rid of the thing when all of a sudden it took a picture of him and tried to start printing. He hit it and tore the printer paper out so that the device fizzled and eventually stopped functioning, spraying ink everywhere, praying that it is now in a landfill or a trash compactor, and one isn't donated or sold to parts, with remnants of his face still on that printer. This story was so close to S tier, but I'm putting it in A because the Game Boy camera didn't use ink. It was a thermal camera with special thermal paper. Just grinds my gears a bit that the thing that the story is centered around isn't accurate to what the thing actually was. But in fairness, it never really states that it was a real Game Boy printer or some crazy homebrew modification that did use ink. But that's still a high A tier for the writing. I honestly just wish there was a bit more horror, but personally, I don't actually know what more would add some good horror to it. Now we have the story of Ikidomari. This is where the author finds a cursed board game and is haunted with creepy cards that cause crazy events. This leads to him dragging his friends in, and they die throughout. I may sound pretty unenthusiastic about this one, and there's a reason why. It's just Jumanji. This goes in the low B tier. It's well written, I like some of the scary ideas, but it's just Jumanji. But replace the animals with Annabelle, the old house with an abandoned building, and one of the cards is a creepy doll that follows the author. Another is what I assume was like a horde of zombies that grabbed a guy, similar to the horde of animals in the original Jumanji movie. It's not incredibly creative, and it's only as high as it is because of the fact that it's well written, and there are some creative parts about it, but I am a bit ashamed to have it this high. First off, it's a board game and not a video game, but I included it because it's under the category I mentioned earlier, so why not? The New Arcade in Town is a story where the author remembers a time when they had a new best friend join them in the new arcade in town. This goes from a neat little story about a realistic virtual reality game to a weird conspiracy theory about bald people and moon monsters. It's getting C tier. Not that scary, and in my opinion, not that good. Metroid 2, The Secret Worlds, follows the author recounting their time as an online forum moderator. He goes over how the user he was messaging found a weird ROM of Metroid 2, and then the guy just eventually disappears. Maybe a high C tier? Not much to this one, personally not much to my liking. It's a little boring, kinda interesting, but no real resolution. It also involves Gunpei Yokoi for some reason, which, honestly enough, really weird choice. Aquarius follows the author with his supercomputer-like rig he uses to play games, and attempts to enter a tournament with his friend. They end up losing because of something on his screen, some flickering dot that made them lose. They check it out and don't understand why it's there. Eventually, the dot and Aquarius begin to make horrific sounds of harsh beeping, and the author's friend dies. This leads to the author throwing his demon computer in a dumpster. I mean, it's alright. Kinda creative, interesting premise. The horror wasn't the best, and it was nice to read. Some sections didn't connect well in my head, but it's alright. B tier. Next we have Skyrim Secrets 1 and 2. I will loop together both, but rank them separately. Skyrim Secrets follows the author writing about a Skyrim mansion Easter egg he found that leads him to getting mug, losing his job, losing his apartment, losing his love, and almost his life. The second installment follows a student who watches a YouTuber attempt following the Creepypasta's instructions on finding the Easter egg, and then broadcasts it to the world to cause mass destruction to fix climate change. The first installment is pretty good, I will say. I'm putting it a little lower in the A tier because I like the idea and writing of it, but it's not the scariest I'd seen. The second will be C tier. It's not really horror at all, just suspense and action more so. Both are well written, but the second story just goes crazy. It does follow a line of logic that kinda makes sense, like I mentioned earlier, but just really not my cup of tea. Entity 303 articles 2 different incidents regarding an entity called Entity 303 that follows and griefs players' worlds in Minecraft, as well as corrupting their computers, websites, and more. The entity causes 2 boys to disappear and 1 to go crazy. I appreciate the thing's influence, but it is more of a Herobrine wannabe than I remember. B tier, even though I have a little bit of nostalgia for it. Faith's game follows a film student on her quest to make a film project to guarantee graduation. She chooses to do it in a mental hospital, and finally one responds, making her spend 6 days with a schizophrenic girl to get her footage. Over the 6 days, the film student notices nothing really crazy about the girl until the 4th day when she learns the girl's imaginary friend that made her do things like pull out her hair. Eventually, the author figures out that a demon had latched onto the girl and taken the form of a character from a Kirby game the girl had been playing on her DS. This leads to the author destroying the DS the girl plays with and bringing her away from the asylum, but realizes the demon latched onto the car and has been manipulating her to write this story and share it to have more people believe in him. S tier. From the suspense to how well it's written to how things seem like they would be realistic reactions, I again like the line of logic, where it's never explicitly shown the powers of the demon or hallucination, but we know that it only drew power from being attributed to something tangible, like a video game character. I loved it and definitely did not do it justice in my summary. Now we have Sonic.exe. Do I even have to explain this one? For like the 6 people who don't know this one, it follows the author getting a CD from a friend telling him to destroy it. He instead plays it, finds it's an old Sonic game, plays it, character dies, and he becomes very cursed. Very basic rundown over. This game had a huge influence. I remember a time in like 2017 when I couldn't find a YouTuber who didn't have some sort of character.exe video. I think they're still around today, actually. The thing isn't incredibly well written, and definitely boring to me because of how many times I've already seen it and heard it, but gets a very high B tier because it's influence, pretty much. Where a kid can be a kid doesn't even get a summary. Just a guy who remembers when his dad would clean out Chuck E. Cheese restaurants, and now he does it with his son. That's literally all. C tier, no horror, okay idea, but there's just literally nothing. Next we have Scream of the End, which follows the author as he is using buckets of water to attack Endermen and taunt them in his friend's server, and eventually, they've had enough, crash his computer. After a few reboot attempts, they eventually transport him to a void-like room where they choose to torment him with scares and darkness until he dies, and the computer shuts down. I like this one. Not the scariest, not the best written, but definitely solid good B tier. Also, I just want to say in the comments section of this story, someone said, "Not everything in the game is coded, just thought I'd let you know." That sounds like the biggest passive-aggressive actually ever. The darkness revolves around the author firing up his laptop to play a Counter-Strike map his friend sent him. The map has a lot of dark spots with an unkillable special character. When the author got tired, he powered off his laptop. But he still saw the figure, until he realized he was staring at his laptop's reflective screen. A tier. I love the usage of, "and then I saw him behind me" in this one, similar to the one-word creepypasta from earlier. I really like this style. It's really well written, in my opinion. Looking for an old game follows the author as he's looking for a game that he used to play with his father, Pitfall. His father had drawn away from his family and then disappeared, and the author is now looking more into it and finds a ROM of Pitfall. He plays it and gets far until it crashes. When it reboots, the character looks like his father, asking him to come find him. Then ends with the author looking to buying tickets to Mexico to find his father. I love the premise of the story. It's an A tier for me. Even though the writing and some logic is weak at times, I love the premise of the cycle. The Sicilian Spectre is a story following 2 game developers pitching their game to different companies, until one took it. It's a 4D horror game that, when played, often had the player scratched, or worse. Finally, on the last test, one of the 2 game devs tries to get to the end, and gets his chest slashed by the demon and dies the next morning in the hospital. I'd say it's a good A tier, maybe. It's an interesting idea of a 4D game rather than VR, which is different, and I think it's clever. At some points, the creepiness was actually very on point, so I enjoyed my read. JVK1166EZ.ESP, I'm not joking, that's the title, is a story about a mysterious Elder Scrolls mod that appeared to do nothing until people found out they needed to use it through an older emulation software. The mod adds an assassin who follows and hunts the player along with an NPC that leads the player to a large chamber. The mod led those who got too far to go crazy in real life. This one I don't personally know how influential or widespread the mod itself was, but I know I've heard it before multiple times. I'm gonna give it a high B tier because it's pretty good, and I'm definitely going crazy myself from reading so many creepypastas. The Hissap hallucination follows the author who worked with Bethesda for a quest in the Elder Scrolls game. The quest becomes buggy and a creepy stitched-together ragdoll teleports itself, and the player messing with them. This one is pretty low C tier. The writing looks good, it's just a bit hard to follow exactly, not much else. Also, I did say earlier it sounded like I'm unenthusiastic. A lot of these later stories are just, like, really short, and some of them are just mostly detail, even if they are longer. So, if you were looking for deeper dives into a lot of these, sorry, there's just not that much. Next is the Fallout 3 Number Station, which is instructions about how if you kill 3Dog in Fallout 3, you can get him into a number station where he'll predict the future through strings of Morse code. I'd say solid B tier, definitely a good one, and if I hadn't known it beforehand, I probably would have gotten a bit more creeped out. Good overall, though. I quite liked it. The Haunted Mario save follows the player as he gets a bootleg Mario cartridge and plays it. Noticing a dark red pipe, he jumps in only to find Bowser and Mario. It ends with the author saying that they are now in the 9th room of Bowser's castle, living as a Boo. Pretty creative short horror idea. I actually kind of liked it. I'm going to put it at mid A tier because I like the novelty of the idea of getting turned into the Boo after dying, but lower A tier because it just pulls a portal gun out of literally nowhere, so yeah. Jack Hill, Mystery of the Game & Watch, is a story following the author as their apartment shows paranormal signs and keeps getting left games signed by a Jack Hill, a boy who had lived in the apartment and jumped out the balcony as well as his mother. The spirit tries to get the author to jump too, but he flees to a hotel where he writes from. C tier. It's just not really that fleshed out, a bit boring, but decently creative idea of what Jack does. Kind of weird of how fast events go by, though. Personally, I think the pacing is what breaks it mostly. Rap Rat follows the story of an author who got scared as a child from the VHS game Rap Rat. He finds it in his adult years and finds it still cursed and now haunts him. He learned that in its creation it was cursed by a Hayden sweatshop worker because a child worker had died in a sewing machine accident. I shitteth you not, I read this and it's actually pretty good. Instant A tier. I like the story and the writing style, along with the crazy Haitian cursed from a sweatshop. I love that detail. Also, I am really sorry if I'm butchering that word. Haitian? Haitian? I can never remember. It's the country of Haiti. The theater follows the author, detailing experiences had with a game called The Theater, with a ticket taker who occasionally turns into a swirled face like a Junji Ito drawing. There's not much to this one, and I do know I've heard it multiple times before. It's pretty well written, so gets in a low A tier, even though my summary doesn't do it justice. Next is actually what I think is a fan-made sequel to The Theater called The True Story of the Theater. This one has more detailed recount, giving more information on rooms and characters in the game. Pretty bland, not much about it, honestly, kind of C tier because it's not really that creepy and actually tries to, in a way, devalue the original theater creepypasta by going, wait guys, it's actually not that scary. Just kind of disappointing. Lavender Town Syndrome, I feel, is self-explanatory. This one I know is infamous. For those who somehow don't know, it's just the idea that the music in Lavender Town from the original Pokemon games caused kids to die and made people uncomfortable, apparently. Pretty good, but honestly, I've heard it so many times before, I barely even skim read it. A tier for its influence and history, pretty much, and it is pretty well written. Pokemon Black is a reason I see Lavender Town Syndrome being so influential. The game has the author playing a bootleg Pokemon game, which has the player pick a ghost Pokemon with the sprite from the Lavender Town fight. The ghost using Curse gets the player throughout the game easily, and leads to an ending cinematic of the graves of all those the player defeated, with the player eventually dying to Ghost's Curse move, only being able to struggle. This one gets an S tier. Because of its history, influence, and creepy factor that's persisted for years, it's impressive, and I'm glad it is where it is. One-man hide-and-seek is a set of instructions to summon a spirit into a doll for hide-and-seek. I won't explain the instructions, because it's just things like pour rice in doll, thread needle, and then a bunch of other spiritual aspects. I give it a solid A tier. Pretty supernatural, and the warning section is interestingly creepy, and I like how it's written. Now, we have Herobrine, arguably one of the most famous gaming creepypastas ever, alongside Jeff the Killer. The story follows the author going through his new world on his slow computer as he saw someone in the default skin with whited-out eyes. He sees strange structures in the world, from forests without leaves to sand pyramids under the sea. Then the author goes to the forums and gets an anonymous message from a user named Herobrine, who tells him to stop. Then, eventually, he asks Notch about the mysterious character and asks if he ever had a brother, of which Notch says, "I did, and he's no longer with us." I have to put this one in S tier. Surely for its influence, it's decently written for how old it is, and it definitely has novelty. I still think that parts of it are pretty good, and it's literally influenced the developers to acknowledge it by putting it in promotional material and even putting it in patch notes. Definitely one of the most, if not the most influential creepypastas of all time. Last, but certainly not least, Polybius. Again, one of the most infamous creepypastas, along with Herobrine, like I mentioned before. It details the experience for when people played Polybius and suffered its ill effects. I'm actually putting this one in A tier, only because of its history and charm. It's not higher. I wish it were, but there's not much substance to the story itself, and I just realized I never really read it before this point. All in all, still a good and influential creepypasta, just I do wish there was more substance. And that's it. I'm so fucking tired. This took a accumulation of 2 weeks of reading creepypastas straight. I don't know why I chose to suffer this way, but I pulled through in the end. I don't actually think this will be as long as I thought it was, but for those who saw the 3 TF2 creepypastas and actually enjoyed that, well, this one's for you, but mostly for me. Anyway, I'm serious. I really enjoyed this project, and I hope you did too. This might actually influence some future videos if you guys enjoy this, and have a happy Halloween. Anyway, it's been me, Moosh. I'll see you later. Arrivederci.